Welcome back, Aspire Leaders. I am so excited for this week as I have someone that actually has saved my life this week in the whirlwind of the book launch and just life in general. As you all know, I have a busy life with my 6 kids and crazy family, but Julia Bialeski is here to really talk about her fantastic book, Leading with Grace. And she's saving me because I had a cancellation this week and she swooped in and is going to be on the podcast. And I'm so excited because she's an amazing leader, author, speaker. So with that, Julia, thank you so much for joining Aspire to Lead.
Thank you so much for having me. And I'm so glad I could save your life this week and that you could save mine and welcome me onto the podcast.
Yes, we've been connected on LinkedIn, so it's been fun to kind of see your journey, see the exciting news of the launch of your book, and can't wait to dive into that wonderful resource. But before we do that, will you just share a little bit about your educational and leadership background?
Sure. So I always like to say that I really have been an educational leader since I was a student. Now that I reflect back and I think about my life, I was always looking for leadership opportunities, even when I was a student. But professionally, I started my career as an elementary teacher and was a teacher of fifth, fourth, and first grades in that order. I did a little bit of curriculum writing and work. In a central office role for a couple of years before I became a school based administrator. And I was an assistant principal and principal for over 10 years before making my most recent transition to a district leadership role on the recruitment side for our district here in Maryland, where we support over 57,000 students. So I've done so many different things in my professional life, but what's really interesting is that I never really felt comfortable putting that title of leader on myself until I sat in the seat of principal. And that really was such a formative leadership experience for me. And now, in hindsight, I look back and I kind of wag my finger at myself that I didn't feel comfortable with that. But that leadership experience was unlike anything else for me, unlike anything else will ever be for me. That's how strongly I feel about it, in really cementing who I was as a leader and allowing myself to fully comfortably step into that title.
There's many directions we can
Yeah.
go with what you just said. So I'm super excited about this conversation. All right. So let's talk about, well, first off, the book, right? Leading with Grace, Cultivating Hope, Authenticity, and a Focus on People Throughout the Leadership Lifespan. So can you just define graceful leadership and what that looks like on a campus for our listeners?
Yeah. So, when I was starting to write the book, I was really wrestling with all of these ideas that at first seemed like they were contradictory ideas that spoke to me about leadership and the experiences that I had specifically as a principal. In the book, I structure each chapter around personal stories in my time in the principal seat. And so I was wrestling with all these ideas, and it felt for so long like it was this dichotomy between caring about people and focusing on them, and also communicating high expectations and being really clear about what my vision was as a leader. And as I wrestled with that, I realized that that was what made that leadership role so important for me, is that I was able to do both of those things at the same time. And so to me, the idea of graceful leadership is always having a focus on people and on the human side of the work that we do, and not sacrificing having really high expectations for myself and high expectations for the people with whom I'm working and who I am serving, so that everybody is bringing their best self to, whether it's school, work, wherever we are, whatever space we are entering, and whatever leadership looks like for us that day. And so in the book, I share a story at the beginning when I'm sort of establishing what graceful leadership is, and I tell a story of an activity we did with our staff, called the 6 word story. And if you're familiar with the Ernest Hemingway story about how someone made a bet with him, bet him $100 or something, that he couldn't tell a story in 6 words, and he did it, and it was for sale, baby shoes, never worn. And that those 6 words tell such an impactful story. And so we challenged our staff on a day that we returned. It was post pandemic. Everyone was coming back together in person for the first time to tell their 6 word story that sort of communicated who they were as an educator. And my 6 word story was be brave and care about people. And so to me, that's kind of what graceful leadership is. It's being brave and caring about people and making sure that you're doing both of those things and bringing both of those things with yourself to work each and every day.
Oh, I love that. And that's a really cool activity. So for anyone listening, steal that because I
Yeah.
bet you can find out a lot about your staff through that activity.
Yep. And there's so many different ways you can go with it, right? So for us, it was really like keeping focused on our why. Why are we here? What brings us to this work? But you could interpret that in so many different ways, and you could do it with students. It would be a really cool activity to do with students that even at the elementary level, they would be able to play with that a little bit.
All right, I want to go back to what you were talking about as you were kind of ascending in your leadership journey and being the
Yeah.
principal and that title. I over the years, a lot of people have discussed this. I know I felt this as a new leader too, of just not feeling comfortable in my own skin and the expectations and who am I going to be as a leader versus actuality of the impact that you're making. And I'm just curious, when you were kind of facing that imposter syndrome, what were some things that you did to get out of that to feel comfortable in that role?
Yeah. So the first thing I react to when I hear you ask that question is you said what were, and you talk about it in the past sense, the past
Yeah.
tense. And I think it's really important to lift up that, at least in my experience with imposter syndrome, it doesn't really go away. You just become aware of it. And so for me, for a very, very long time, back to when I was a child and maybe was not feeling confident or comfortable, um, in seeing myself as a leader or picturing myself in a leadership role one day when I was an adult and working. Um, I wasn't aware that imposter syndrome was a thing. It didn't have a name for me. And I don't remember people really talking openly about having these feelings of doubt or wrestling with these emotions that I now know are so common and everyone experiences them. Um, and so for me, I'm really passionate about talking about it because I think, well, if someone had talked about this with me 20 years ago, 30 years ago, I might, who knows where I would be, right? I had to sort of get there on my own. So that's something I always really want to lift up when we talk about imposter syndrome. It's like not something, maybe some people do beat it permanently and then they never face it again, and there could be people out there who have never experienced that, right? But for many of us, it's something that we wrestle with sometimes on a daily basis every time we change roles. The leadership lifespan that I write about in the book is really this idea that we go through many different leadership roles in our lives, in our careers, and we're going to encounter some similar themes or some similar experiences everywhere that we go. And imposter syndrome is one of those things, and we need to be prepared for it. So I think just defining it and knowing what it is and being aware when you're in a new situation is so helpful because you're ready, you're prepared for it, and then acknowledging it that you're experiencing that and that it's a temporary feeling. Okay, right now I'm feeling a little bit uncertain, or maybe I'm facing something I've never had to deal with before, or a question I don't know the answer to, and that's uncomfortable, but this is a temporary feeling because I will get through this and I will learn more. So, some of the things like the quick hacks that I really love about facing imposter syndrome, whether it's in a leadership role or just in any other aspect of my life, are when you are feeling bogged down by the things that you don't know, by the things that you haven't learned yet. To really try to flip that and focus on at the end of the day, what are three things I learned today? There might be 500 things that I realized I still don't know, but what are three things that I learned today? Write them down, grab a sticky note, jot them down. Track them on your calendar or in a journal, whatever works for you. Because to me, it's really impactful to be able to look back over time at all of the things that I did learn. Because then I can look back a year later and think, wow, where have I come in a whole year? That maybe if I hadn't taken the time to focus on that, I wouldn't have seen. So that's like one of my favorite tips for facing imposter syndrome. The other one that I found is really helpful for me, and other people that I talk to who wrestle with this and experience it have kind of shared that belief and found that as well, is when I am experiencing moments of doubt, or I'm feeling like, am I really the right person to be in this seat at this time? Do I have the ability to face this challenge? Is to turn it outward and to try to go and do something helpful for someone else. Because what I find is that that is true to who I am. I like to try to serve people and to support them and to build them up when they're feeling, down. So I try to find somebody who I can build up. Maybe it's leaving them a note. When I was a principal and assistant principal, I was known for my handwritten notes. So maybe it's just like jotting something down on a card or a sticky note and putting it in somebody's mailbox. Maybe it's going and seeing if I can fill in for somebody and help them to give them a break for a couple of minutes. It's just um, I find that being of service to other people kind of gets me out of my own head. And then the benefit of that is, that happiness kind of spreads. It pays forward, and then other people around you are happier. You're getting this good feeling from doing something from someone else, and so it kind of beats those feelings of doubt that you have. So those are kind of like two favorite things that are actionable that I do. But I think the biggest thing with imposter syndrome is we have to be prepared for it. We have to know it's going to come and to know that it happens to almost everybody. And people just don't talk about it enough. So we're in our own heads and we're so aware of what we're worrying about. But people around us just might not be sharing that with us. And to me, that's the authenticity piece is
Yep.
I think if I share it, the more then the more other people see, okay, I might have been questioning whether leadership was something that was really for me, but it's for anybody. It's for everybody. We all have it in us, and usually we're the ones who hold ourselves back the most, right?
Yeah.
From seeking opportunities or from fully taking advantage of those opportunities.
Yeah, I love the transparency. And yes, for anyone that's listening, especially our new leaders, like you will face this. And it doesn't matter if you're in year 1 or year 10 of being a leader. I mean, it pops up, especially when you're getting negative feedback from someone. It could be a student, a parent, a teacher, maybe it's another, leader in the district. So
Yeah,
just know that yes, you may feel like you've beaten the imposter syndrome, but it may creep up again, and it may be, wrapped around self-doubt specifically, but know that it does go away, and that you can find, similar to what Julia just talked about, strategies to kind of work through those feelings and those emotions. But you are not weird. This happens to
yeah,
everybody at some point in your journey, and I love that you're speaking out about it and letting everybody know that this is a very common emotion that our leaders are facing.
very common.
All right, so let's talk about something that is another kind of hot topic too, because I've experienced this in a lot of other leaders, and this is actually something I've probably one of my more popular keynotes is just like the well-being of leaders. And I know I took, and I've said this before on the podcast, I took horrible care of myself, lack of
Yeah.
sleep, never ate. I mean, I was living on coffee, and I had health concerns due to that. So I know there's a lot of leaders that are probably listening and shaking their head. Yes, yes, yes. I've checked all those boxes, and
Hmm.
I'm not doing a very good job about that. So can you just talk about just battling just the stress, the burnout, and how our leaders can maintain their best self and their well-being, both emotionally and physically?
Yeah, this is such an important topic, and it's one of my favorite things to talk about. Um, I think that the trickiest part with battling burnout is that ultimately we are each responsible for our own well being. And often, our instinct when we are experiencing periods of burnout, when we know we are not taking good care of ourselves, our instinct as humans, I think, is to look for someone to point our finger at. Like, this is my employer's fault. This is my staff's fault. This is whose fault is this that I am feeling overworked, or I am too tired, I don't have enough time for exercise or to eat properly or to engage in hobbies or to socialize with friends. We look for who can we blame for this because it can't possibly be my fault, and it's not always my fault, right? It's more nuanced than that. But ultimately, the only person who's going to do anything about it is me. Nobody is coming in to rescue me, because everyone is experiencing that. And so you mentioned, certainly burnout for leaders, but for educators in general, it is rough out there and everyone is experiencing burnout. And then our families and our communities are experiencing burnout. It's a widespread issue well outside of education. We know this. And so our students are experiencing burnout with increasing demands on them. So it is so important, like imposter syndrome, first of all, I think, to talk about it, for people to be really transparent about when they are experiencing challenges, because as leaders, we have that ability to shape the culture, to model for other people. And so sometimes that modeling is saying, wow, I really need to rethink my boundaries here. I have noticed that I've been checking email 20 hours a day and that I never seem to really be able to disconnect. Um, I need to put a boundary in place. And boundaries can be very personal, right? Like what works for you might be very different than what works for me. And what works for me today might be very different than what works for me 6 months from now, which is the other tricky part about managing burnout. Is it's not a set it and forget it. It's not something that you put a routine in place and then you never have to attend to it again. We have to constantly be attuned to like what's out of balance in our lives. And that idea of work life balance. It doesn't mean that we don't focus on work, and it doesn't mean that we don't focus on life. It really does mean that we have to find at any given time what needs our attention right now. So that can be a little bit tiring and exhausting sometimes too. So um, those are kind of my general thoughts about well-being and why it's so important in leadership. But the modeling piece is huge. So I remember so vividly, and I tell this story in the book. um, I left school one Friday before winter break, and I had to like crawl to my car. I mean, I was so exhausted. I was so burned out. I just barely made it right to the end of that break. And I had just been working around the clock for months and months and months, probably over a year. And I realized like I need rest in all of the ways that you need rest, right? I need to disconnect. And I hadn't had that opportunity. The weekends were not doing it for me. Even if there had been a long weekend in there, it just wasn't. And so I came home and I told my family, I am not going to open my computer over this entire winter break. And that was not like this extreme proclamation. There's nothing special about that. But for me at that moment, it was I need a reset. And I experienced a lot of anxiety around not opening that computer. There were times when I really wanted to, and I almost did, but I didn't. Um, and at the end of the break, I felt so rested. And I thought, how can I carry this with me? Right? Because I have to go back to work. I can't just not open my computer ever again, and that's going to solve the problem. But I needed that reset to then be able to think about how can I carry this forward with me? So, what boundary can I put into place? For me, it was I'm going to set a time every evening. And after that time, I will not look at email until the next morning. I do really well with very concrete boundaries. Other people don't need something that prescribed or that specific to follow. But what I found over the next month was the most interesting part, because I had had so much anxiety about disconnecting and what am I going to miss and who isn't going to get a response from me. And I really value responsiveness as a leader. I pride myself on that. And I wrap up so much of my identity of myself in that. But what I found over the next month was that somehow my work felt more manageable, not less manageable, when I was rested. I was like laughing at home. I was more present at home for my family. So I didn't feel like I was failing my family in the way that I had prior to this reset. So boundaries work really, really well for me and for a lot of people, but boundaries are personal and you have to kind of decide, and sometimes trial and error, to see what's going to work best for you. And we all go through seasons in life where that might look a little bit different. The other thing that was really impactful with the modeling is that I stood up in front of my staff and I announced to them, I just need you all to know that I am not going to be checking email after 6 p.m. So if you email me after 6 p.m., just know I won't see it until the next day. And if you have an emergency, here's how you can get in touch with me. But I stood up and I said that and I explained why. And after that staff meeting, people came up to me with tears in their eyes and they told me that hearing you say that made me realize that it's okay for me to do that too. And I think we undervalue that as leaders a lot. the impact of our actions, right? We are all about our words as leaders, but the impact of our actions. And I realized how many people have been walking around this school thinking that they needed to be connected to work or that it wasn't okay for them to leave at the end of their contractual day, that it wasn't okay for them to say, this work will still be here tomorrow when I get here tomorrow, and it's okay because of actions that I wasn't even consciously communicating to them. So the impact of that modeling, being transparent about what the boundaries are as a leader, like the ripple effect that that can have on other people's well-being is really incredible. And I've never forgotten about that. Um, and I still see it in myself how when people who are in leadership positions who I report to, when they model that, how helpful that is for me. So it's been affirmed again and again, but it sort of took that experience for me to realize the impact of that. Um, and how just having a leader who not just tells you it's okay to take a break, to pick up your work the next day, but shows you that they are doing that too, that speaks volumes louder than the words.
Yeah, I think this message is so important. This is something I'm like on my soapbox
Yes.
preaching from the mountaintop because yeah, I always say the email's the devil for a leader. Like you could easily spend the entire day in your office just working on email
100%.
and you could be on your phone in the evening well beyond. And if it's an emergency, they're gonna contact you. I've gotten
Mhm.
plenty of phone calls or texts about a
Yep.
student that's in need that require my attention. Of course, I dropped everything to meet the need of that student and that experience, but it wasn't through email that they're going to get a hold of me. So
Right.
you just have to understand that, like you said, it can wait till tomorrow if it's not an emergency. I always like to go in early to the office, because I love that like hour time of nobody's in the building, nobody's going to interrupt me. I'm awake, I've got my coffee, I'm ready for the day. I'm in a better mental space in that
Yes.
time than trying to answer it at 9 p.m. at night. So for everyone that's listening, yes, Julia's speaking wise words. Please take her advice. Okay. All right. I want to talk about real quick just the book. I would love you just to highlight anything else that we haven't talked about in regards to leading with grace. And then, of course, we're going to talk about some actionable items for our listeners. So, as far as leading with grace, is there any last words for those who are looking to grab this resource?
Yeah. So I just would like to share, I mentioned that I wrote Leading with Grace, really using stories from my time as in the principal's seat as anchors for each chapter. But I set out to write a book that I felt that I needed when I became a principal. There were so many wonderful resources out there, and I had access to exceptional leadership development team in my district, to wonderful colleagues who were all a support, to a really supportive family who were behind me. But there were moments where I felt like, am I the right person for this job? And I needed that hope, and I never found a resource that really hit the mark for me. So the book is structured around the leadership lifespan, which is the idea that in every leadership role we are in, whether we are a student leader, whether we are an instructional team leader, an instructional coach, an assistant principal, a principal, and whether we're new to that role or a veteran in that role, we go through a life cycle wherever we might be. We might change schools and now we're restarting the life cycle, or maybe we get promoted mid year and now we're restarting the life cycle. And there are common things that we have to do along the way as leaders, kind of in every role and every situation and season that we're in. We have to enter and have to have an entry plan for that role. We have to face imposter syndrome when it comes to us. We have to be prepared to communicate with people through a whole variety of means, with a whole variety of needs and lenses that they're communicating with us. We're going to have to manage a crisis at some point, large or small, or sometimes many, and we need to be prepared for that. We're going to have to staff our schools. We're going to need to retain people and evaluate people. We're going to need to build a legacy, hopefully, behind us so that whoever is interested in leadership, when we are no longer there, they will be there and the work will continue after we're gone. And then eventually we're going to exit a role, whether that's to go on to our next opportunity, for some of us to retire, whatever that might look like. And so each chapter is structured around one of those stops on the leadership lifespan, with personal stories from my time as a principal, maybe some research and some tips for that topic, and then some some opportunities for reflection. So there's actually reflection questions in the book where you can write in the book if that's your jam, and sort of reflect and think about how you can apply this to your own work, because graceful leadership is very personal, right? I shared my personal mantra of what that means to me. But really, the book is not meant to be like a roadmap for what you do, but rather sort of hearing some stories from me and then thinking about how that relates to you in your own work. And I'm really proud of the way that it came out. So I hope that it's a wonderful resource for your listeners.
Oh, for sure. And shout out to School Rubric, who is your
Yeah.
publisher. And I want to make sure everyone understands that I'll have the link in the show notes for you to pick up this resource, Leading with Grace. And with that, Julia, will you just share a little bit of wisdom as far as an actionable item? It's great that they're listening to all of the wonderful insights you've provided today, but if there's something they could do tomorrow or next week to enhance their leadership journey, what would you recommend?
You know what? Something that's really been resonating with me lately, on my own journey as I've had the book come out and I'm kind of exploring this new side of my leadership and my life is to take a risk. So I think my advice is think about something that feels just a little bit uncomfortable to you, right? Is it reaching out to somebody on social media like I did with you and saying, hey, would you like to collaborate? That can feel really uncomfortable for some people. Like I'm putting myself out there, right? And they might say no or they might ignore me, but guess what? They might also say yes. And so I am like loving the opportunities that come with stretching yourself a little bit, taking a tiny risk. I'm not talking about doing something rash, or something dangerous, but doing something that just feels a little bit like you're stretching yourself. And so that might be going to one of the leaders with whom you work and asking them for an opportunity that maybe you haven't been directly asked to do, but that you think would help to get you to the next place in your career where you'd like to be. Maybe it's chairing a committee. Maybe it's getting an opportunity to shadow them for a day. Maybe it's asking to take them for coffee and ask them about their leadership journey. I love to hear about other people's journeys, not so that I can follow the same path, but so that I can get a set of experiences and hear about everybody's own journey and how that's led them to where they are. So that's my advice to listeners, because it's something that I've been leaning into in my own leadership is take a risk. What's one little thing you can do tomorrow that makes you just a tiny bit uncomfortable, but that would get you closer to where you want to be?
Yeah, I love it. Yeah, if you don't ask, you're not gonna ever receive anything. So
100%. That's right.
you can't, just like you were talking about relying on other people for mental health and getting yourself right. I mean, the same thing with trying to move up the ladder for opportunities. You got to ask. So
That's right.
well, I will say thank you for reaching out because this has been a wonderful conversation. And I want to make sure that everyone is connecting with you. So, obviously, for those who've been watching on YouTube, I've had your website up on the screen, but we just share your website and any other social media that you would love for folks to connect you with.
Sure. Yeah. My website is juliabialeski.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Instagram. I have a YouTube channel I've been kind of playing around on a little bit, and would love to connect with listeners. So I hope you look me up.
Wonderful. And then also you speak. So, if they want to connect with you in regards to speaking, what are some topics that you love to present on?
Yeah, so well-being is like my passion topic, and I have a couple of opportunities with different audiences coming up, to talk about well-being. I'm speaking at a women's conference during Women's History Month, like really focused on women in the workforce thriving with their work-life balance and well-being. I'm speaking at another conference later this spring, so well-being is a huge passion topic of mine and the thing I love to speak about the most. Also love to talk about imposter syndrome. So I love that you asked me about that because, again, I just find the more we talk about it, the more people know it's normal, and they might stretch themselves into a position, a leadership role that they might not have otherwise sought.
Awesome. So I'll make sure that I have all of the links in the show notes. So if you head over to joshstamper.com, you'll be able to find the link for Leading with Grace and then also Julia's website and social media links. So that way you can connect with her. Make sure that you're not only grabbing the resource, but having her speak at your conference or at your district. And yeah, with that, Julia, thank you so much for, again, saving my life and jumping on here to talk about your fantastic new book, and congratulations on the launch of Leading with Grace.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so much fun.